Thank you very much, Tommaso, and thank you, Paolo, for the wonderful opportunity to participate in this delightful program. As Tommaso just said, competition law draws a basic distinction between the behavior of firms acting alone and acting in concert. Generally speaking, with the exception of the cap on excessive prices under Article 102, a firm that raises its prices by itself faces no antitrust consequences. If you do it with your competitor, you face severe fines, and in some jurisdictions, you can go to prison as a result. So the distinction between the two kinds of behavior is fundamental to the operation of a competition law system. This one is mine, but I'm happy to do the others as well. Thanks.
No connection.
I know how to do this the old-fashioned way, so let me give you some basics to start. In the US experience, it's useful to think about what competition law did to efforts by firms to cooperate in setting terms of their relationship. Before 1890, before the US adopts its competition law, it was common for companies, as it is today, to work together to set prices, especially on public tenders. Many of the earliest reported decisions in the US experience deal with public tendering. Indeed, crucial decisions dealing with the formation of jurisprudence, dealing with agreements and forbidden behavior come in the context of public tendering decisions. Before 1890, this was done openly. You can read newspaper adverts in the period before 1890 that read like this. The city of New York is soliciting tenders for pipe for the construction of its water system and extension. We are the pipe manufacturers. We will be meeting in the Plaza Hotel on July 5th at 2 p.m. for purposes of setting the bids that we will submit to the city of New York. If you'd like to join us, please do, because there were basically no consequences for doing that. What does competition law do? It drives that behavior underground. And what you have over time is basically an arms race between competition authorities and would-be colluders, with competition authorities dealing progressively stronger means of detection and sanctions, but the firms responding by better and better techniques for concealment. And at any one moment, it's been the case that as soon as you think you have the ideal detection mechanism, there are countermeasures. And the countermeasures race has basically put more and more of a premium on detecting the fact of illegal collusion and interpreting what behavior constitutes an agreement. And the issue for antitrust is to infer when indeed an agreement has taken place, when you're relying on circumstantial evidence. I'm going to review quickly the US status quo for doctrine dealing with what constitutes an agreement. In many ways, this has strong similarities to analytical approaches that jurisdictions around the world use, because this is so fundamental a question: what's unilateral and what's not? And then to turn to the role of circumstantial proof in establishing the fact of concerted action. In doing this, I'm giving you my views only and not those of the Competition and Markets Commission in the United Kingdom. This is joint work with a number of co-authors and students, with Bob Marshall and Leslie Marks, Allison Jones at King's College, two of my students, Damon and Emma, who've joined us here today, and Rob Anderson, until recently with the WTO. And what I'm doing reflects in many ways the contributions of all of them to this effort. I want to highlight two resources I'm drawing on. The first is Bob and Leslie's book, The Economics of Collusion, MIT Press in 2012. If there were a fire in my building at George Washington in Washington, and I could carry two things out in the fire, I would first take the photograph from my wedding with my wife, and I would take that first. But the other thing I would take with me is this book. This, in many ways, is the best single volume written about how cartels function. And Bob and Leslie put that together by studying every published English language decision from Europe, the United States, Canada, and elsewhere on how cartels operate. And from that, they derived a number of observations about how to find them, how to undermine them, and what cartels do to defeat efforts at enforcement. It's simply the best single volume that you can purchase that focuses on what cartels do in order to succeed. It's somewhat unnerving. If I was trying to form a cartel, I would read this book. It has an element of how to build a nuclear weapon to it. It also deals with how to stop nuclear proliferation, but in its own way, it is a somewhat dangerous book. If you ever want to run a cartel, read this book first. What they have done that informs my views about plus factors and identifying agreement is to focus first and foremost on how cartels are structured and what they must do to operate. Tommaso Valletti yesterday told us at lunch that running a good cartel is not easy. And he's so right, and Bob and Leslie underscore that. Forming a cartel by itself involves challenges, but in some ways it's not that hard. It's running it and making it work that's really difficult. As the Wright brothers found, getting an aircraft airborne is not such a challenge. In 1903, when they did their major path-breaking experiments, other people had flown things before. The real trick was to do it under control. And what the Wright brothers brought to the process was a way of establishing controlled flight, not simply flight. And it is the control part that is the difference between a cartel that is pointless and a cartel that works. And they form their impressions, again, by looking at past decisions. This is what we would call the operational research. And they looked at what cartels had to do to succeed. The richest source of insight for this are the published decisions, until the recent settlement procedure reforms in the European Commission, the published decisions of the European Commission. I don't think the Commission really knew what it was doing for researchers and others, but in these long, ponderous decisions, you had breathtaking detail about what the cartels had to do to work and how they dealt with the challenges of maintaining consensus and dealing with deviation by cartel members and the external threats that press upon the effectiveness of the cartel. Bob and Leslie also have done lots of work consulting in the vitamins case, in just about every major case involving the chemicals and chemicals-related sector in the last 20 years. And they've derived a number of insights from their own experience as well. So what I have to say focuses mainly on developing lessons about detection, inference of agreement from what they've done by way of this work that focuses on what cartels have done in the past. A quick primer on the Doctrine of Agreement. It's well-established law in most jurisdictions that if you have direct evidence of misconduct, you've got everything you need. What's direct evidence? A powerful example, the wonderful black and white videotapes of the lysine cartel participants. If you want a refresher on those, use the search engine of your choice, plug in lysine cartel videos, and you will get 6 of them. One of them is called by the Department of Justice the greatest hits. These are the clips of the cartel participants, unknown to them, being filmed by the FBI as they formulated their agreement. The production values aren't very good, but there are subtitles, and it gives you a running account of what they did to make it work. If you have that kind of direct evidence, you don't have to worry about what I'll be talking about today. Or if you have the testimony of an insider, if you have an audio tape of someone who was body-wired and talked to other cartel members, the proof matter is simplified. But what antitrust enforcement did is made it harder and harder to get that kind of evidence. From the beginning, courts have said you can prove the fact of agreement with circumstantial evidence. You don't have to have the live eyewitness testimony that says, I saw Bill pull the trigger and hit Alberto. You can say, Bill and Alberto went into the room. I heard the argument on the inside. I heard Bill say, I'm tired of you criticizing my research. I'm going to shoot you in the arm. Bang! The gun hits the floor. Bill's fingerprints and palm print are all over the weapon. It's not necessary for a witness to testify and say, I saw him do it. Circumstantial proof can be powerful and effective proof of the fact of a cartel. The jurisprudence also says that the mere fact that firms have done something in parallel is not enough. Without more, if everyone has raised their prices at the same time, not enough. Without more, if the only evidence is their prices have all risen and remained at a high level, not enough. The courts have said the mere fact of parallel behavior is insufficient. One of the great words in English law is the word mere, M-E-R-E. It raises the question, what more than mere parallel behavior is enough? And the answer in the jurisprudence has been to look for additional proof. The earliest case said you need parallelism plus something else, thus introduces the notion of plus factors. What something else is sufficient to establish the fact of agreement. The courts and commentators have developed a list of these things over time. A variety of industry structural features, small number of firms or large number of firms, stable market shares over a long period of time or great instability, price increases in the face of declining demand, or price increases in the face of enormous excess capacity and weak demand, structural industry features that have sometimes been used in cases, and a more detailed examination of conduct. The list from the US will ask, have these people done it before? Inference, if they've done it before, they know how to do it, they might be doing it again. Are there extensive communications among them, especially extensive communications that take place in the run-up to a price increase in which all seem to be joining in? The complexity of the behavior, I said before, mere parallel behavior isn't enough. But if the behavior is especially complex, intricate, involving a series of parallel, intricate movements, almost like ships in a convoy navigating at night without the benefit of any form of illumination, and they're moving in exactly the same time, they're turning at the same time, some courts have said there are parallel movements that are so complex and intricate and synchronous that you can't imagine that they are taking place without the fact of coordination. And last are firms taking steps that would be irrational for them unless all were committed to a common set of practices. This is a typical list of plus factors. And if you look at the typical American treatise on competition law, and you look at the chapter dealing with agreement, you will see an elaborated list of factors that look like this on a page. What's been the traditional approach in the jurisprudence to deciding what number of plus factors is enough? It's fairly mechanical in most instances. There is a checklist, an elaborated version of this. And it's almost as though the court or the jury go down the list and saying, how many do I have? Ticking the box as they go along with the rough intuition that if you get 2 or 3 out of a list of 12, you've got enough. That's enough. No explanation in the cases usually about how those plus factors are related to the accomplishment of cartel coordination tasks, but simply the fact of creating a critical mass of these factors and saying there are enough of them, therefore the product that we saw, parallel conduct, must have been the result of those factors without an informative discussion about how those factors are strongly suggestive that the parallel behavior we observed was not coincidental, it was part of a common undertaking. The emerging approach in the literature and some of the modern cases. It basically says, let's start by asking how cartels function. What must they do to succeed? And once we've done that, we will take the observed plus factors and relate them directly to the performance of cartel cases so we can tell a narrative that explains how the cartel functioned and why an inference of concerted action is more plausible than an inference of unilateral action. And just as a refresher, what does a cartel have to do to work? The first three items I've got under the top line are George Stigler's 1964 article. Still a very good starting place to read and understand what coordinated action means and what it takes. The firms have to form a consensus, harder than you might think, usually because there will be a disagreement between newer firms with lower costs but lower market shares and older incumbent firms that want to protect legacy market shares despite having high costs. First thing we have to do is to decide what to do. The modern arrangement, by the way, is some form of market share agreement, or in the case of procurement, a bid rotation scheme that gives everyone some measure of assurance about who will be winning how many tenders over time. Sometimes that's committed to a very specific form of direct evidence. As a junior lawyer in the law firm in which I worked for 3 years, I was doing a routine document review for a client and came upon an early version of a spreadsheet. In one column were the procurement events. In the second column, the date of the award. The third column, who won. And in the fourth column was reason why we did not win. There were 4 suppliers. Our client was one of them. And 3 of the 4 entries in the why we didn't win column were not our turn. They were not referring to a fact of cosmic chance, the give and take of the universe. This was a conscious reflection of the operation of the bid rotation scheme. That's one way to allocate the opportunities, the gains from cooperative behavior. The second key task is to detect deviations, and the third is to punish them. Beyond that, though, if you take Michael Porter's wonderful 5 forces diagram that appears in many business school texts, Porter starts by saying, what are the threats to firm profitability? Either an individual firm or a collection of firms. There are several visible threats. One, buyer resistance. A number of standard economic models like Cornot and Bertrand model buyers as though they are sheep. They passively watch what the sellers are doing and they don't fight back. Indeed, they often fight back. So one threat is your buyers are going to do something, sometimes integrate vertically to buy the input that you're providing. Sometimes it is entrants coming in. They see the prices going up and they try to charge in. Sadly, in public procurement policy often makes it easier for the cartel to keep them out. You heard the description yesterday about the U.S. frozen fish cartel. That worked for 20 years because the domestic content purchasing requirement compelled the U.S. government to buy only fish from U.S. producers. If they had allowed in fish from the foreign suppliers, the U.S. would have been covered with frozen fish to a depth of about 100 meters from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. But indispensable to the management of the cartel was the very convenient government policy of saying U.S. buyers only. You can imagine that every night, certainly in any city with a large number of religious institutions, that they spread incense or lit candles every night to the god of domestic purchasing requirements and said, thank you very much indeed for that. You also have to deal with mavericks in the industry who didn't join with you. Again, to use the Wright brothers' notion again here, the controlled flight involves doing all of these things beyond forming a consensus. And if you can't do them, you're wasting your time. You deserve to go to prison, not for violating the law, but for stupidity. Because to think that you have solved the problem by meeting in a room with your rivals and saying, shall we raise prices? Would that be a good idea? Yes. If you think that's the only thing you have to do, you've simply invited trouble with no prospect of gain, because you need a plan to do these other things. One way to think of these plus factors that goes beyond simply ticking boxes and saying, do we have these factors, is to focus on what Bob Leslie and the late Hal White and I have referred to as superplus factors. That is there behavior that has an unusually close connection to what cartels do? And the intuition is, if you see behavior that is frequently related to the successful operation of a cartel, that's behavior that's worth focusing on more carefully. If you see them doing certain things repeatedly, that's worth one of two things. It's worth a dawn raid, it's worth an investigation, or if you were a tribunal or a court, it justifies a conclusion that this behavior was concerted action, that the observed parallel acts were not the result of unilateral decision making. What are these? To finish by going over each of these as a way to think of things. No cartel works well without communications. Indispensable. Too complex to make it work. Too complex to do all of these things. In order to build trust and to deal with apparent deviations, was it a mistake or did you do it on purpose? Really important to talk and keep talking. This, I think, is the current vulnerability of the algorithmic pricing theory of liability. Can the machines do it by themselves? My acquaintances in the field of artificial intelligence say that's the problem right now. We might get there at some point, but the essence of effective communication is a human being who understands the nuance of human behavior. Are they lying to me? Is it truth? Is it something in between? Was this a mistake? In the context of my larger relationship, how do I interpret this behavior? That's something that the state of the art for mechanical intelligence doesn't do so well right now. Human beings tend to be needed to do that effectively. But the fact of extensive communications, in particular, do they talk to each other a lot? Have they formulated a mechanism for communications in the period that runs up to the cartel itself? And do you see outbursts of communications of different kinds after the cartel is formed, but you're witnessing apparent deviations or entry, for example, from a firm not part of the cartel that threatens to unravel the cartel? Second, in the procurement area, we're enormously suspicious of subcontracting, especially subcontracting plans that are packed into the design of the tender as well, where sometimes the firms will say, if I get this award, I bill. My colleagues here on the podium will get a subcontract. Yes, they're tendering against me, but they're going to get subcontracts. What is that? That is the credible commitment I have as part of the cartel agreement that says, I'm going to win the first one, but you will not be stranded. And when you, Tommaso, win the second one, you'll be doing the same thing for the rest of us. You're making a commitment to allocate the rewards from the cartel. And that allocation process is indispensable to achieving a commitment to the concerted effort. So, a subcontracting commitment that says, I'm going to get the award, but I've promised these other guys who, yes, are tendering against me that they're going to get subcontracts. Similarly distressing is a pattern where you might not see that commitment spelled out in the tender, but it turns out that's what happens as soon as the tender is awarded to me. That within a breathtakingly short period of time, they're all working with me now, and they've joined me up. Interesting ambiguous circumstance, the bid protest. We can think of all the good reasons for having the bid protest. There's a somewhat sinister reason for having the bid protest. I win. I wasn't supposed to win. It was supposed to be Tommaso. Tommaso protests. What's the basis for his protest? Is it we had a bid rotation scheme and Bill cheated? No. The reason for the bid protest is that there's some deficiency in the way in which the tender was evaluated, and what he's seeking to do, in effect, is to slow down the procurement, perhaps stop it, especially in the hope that I will go to him and say, Tommaso, it was a mistake. Sorry, it won't happen again. Maybe I pay him something that's called green mail to go away. Maybe I agree with the procurement authority, oh, this should be done over. Terrible error on my part. Maybe I even withdraw from the procurement. The bid protest mechanism has the good benefit being a way to discipline the procurement process in a healthy way, but it's also a ready-made device by which I can complain that my rivals have not fulfilled their obligation to me under the procurement collusive scheme that we have designed separately. But extensive subcontracting is a matter of real concern, I think, when you see members of the tendering pool almost immediately or routinely turning to each other and saying, would you do some of the work for me? A third item that is a matter of concern is where you see a significant member of the relevant collection of participants in the sector, the person who won the tender and my subcontracting brethren here, when you see them engaging in a pattern of refusals to deal with suppliers of inputs to rivals who might have won a tender or might be tendering. How can I deal with the maverick or the entrant who's coming in to disrupt the cartel? There are the four of us, but let's say for a second as we go through, let's suppose Michaela won't play. The other three of us will, Michaela won't. He's a maverick, he's a holdout. How do we discipline him and deal with him? We go to all the input suppliers. Let's say we're paving roads. We go to everyone who supplies bitumen, asphalt, and say, we'll pay you not to deal with him. Let's collectively, the three of us, go to them and pay them off. And they say, well, why would we ever agree with anyone not to deal with a potential customer? Why would we do that? And we explain, we have an arrangement. It works. We have a pattern that determines that we win. We make higher than ordinary profits. We'll share some with you. But the condition is you don't deal with Michaela. Cut him off. A common exclusive dealing arrangement or a bargained for refusal to deal is for those of us who are in the cartel to go to the input supplier to deny the rival access to an input that they need to succeed. So if you observe a pattern of exclusive dealing, refuses to deal, arrangements of this kind on the part of the suppliers in the sector, the people who are tendering, it's probably not accidental. It's probably something they're doing to deal with someone who's a holdout or someone who's an entrant trying to come in. And the last thing that one can observe, although this tends to require a dawn raid in order to identify it or detect it, but sometimes firms will reveal it inadvertently, is incentives they give their sales force and their sales representatives. Firms know enough about competition law to know that it can be hazardous to engage in a cartel. The people who are running the cartel know that they will not probably be implementing it entirely by themselves. There are people within the sales force or the organization they have to deal with. They know it is risky for them to tell, for example, the people preparing the bids, submit this high bid. The person preparing the bid says, why? We can beat that price. We've done better. We have much lower costs. Why aren't we going after that business? Why aren't we tendering here? One answer could be the truth. Shut the door. We have an arrangement. We're doing bid rotations or customer allocations or geographic territorial allocations. That's not our testimony. It's not our turn. That's why we're not playing here. That person you've just told could become a whistleblower. They could be upset. They could somehow disclose the fact of this. They might even tell a purchasing official who asks, why don't you guys ever bid? Why don't you bid to pave the roads here? And the answer is, it's our policy not to. What do you mean policy? Well, I was told by my supervisor we don't bid there because that's going to be Tommaso's. He gets those. We don't. It could be disclosed. What you want not to do is to tell the person who's implementing the program why you're doing it. Too many people know about it, too many problems will emerge. What I say instead is, this year we're emphasizing price over volume. That is, our strategy is to emphasize margins, not simply the volume of work. So the way that we're going to try to maximize the performance of our company this year is price, margins, not volume. That's why we're not going after that work. Yes, we could get it, but the margins won't be that good. We're going after work where the margins are better. The person inside who's doing the bidding says, I disagree, but all right, that's your call. It's much different from telling them, why are we doing it? We're doing it as part of the bid rotation scheme. So what we would suggest, and we think that some of the jurisprudence picks up on this more, is that if the court is asking, well, which of these plus factors really matters? What we would do in litigation is say, where there's evidence of these things, these are really worth looking for. Because why? Guesswork, intuition? No. 120 years of antitrust enforcement experience says these are the ones that really matter. This is what they do to make it work. This is not a hunch. This is a careful reconstruction and diagnosis of what the cartels have done in the past. Or if you're thinking, should we open a file? Should we do a dawn raid? The communications, the subcontracting, these are the sorts of things, if I were asked by a supervisor or a magistrate, should we do a dawn raid? Why? These are the kinds of things we're looking at, asked, why are they significant? There's a lot of history that says these are the things that matter. Thank you.